Alright, so this should be the third and final video for completing this lab. And at the end of the last video, we went over what these different fossils were and just talked about them a little bit. I showed you some pictures. We also talked about how they give you an idea of the actual size of the sample. So this shell is actually 2/3 its actual size in the drawing. Here, this little foraminifera is actually drawn 10 times its actual size and would in reality be quite small. And then here we have the brachiopod, which is 1x its true size. Here we have the annularia, 2/3 its actual size. Now we haven't gone over geologic time yet. That's something that we'll do in a couple of weeks. But I'm sure that you've all heard of the Jurassic period. And there's actually many different geologic time periods, the Jurassic only being one of them. There were 3 time periods that the dinosaurs were in existence. For example, the Triassic and also the Cretaceous. Everybody's heard of the Jurassic though. There are other time periods too, Silurian and Permian and Pennsylvanian, Mississippian, Devonian, Triassic, and so on. We'll spend much more time on geologic time in the future. But as far as the lab goes, this is telling you the time range that these different creatures existed for. So all 4 of these organisms are now extinct. And this is saying that, for example, the Palicoderm lived from the Silurian time through to the Permian time. And I know that might not make much sense right now, but just follow along. Here, the foraminifera lived during the Pennsylvanian time. I wouldn't worry about lower or middle right now. This particular species of brachiopod lived from Mississippian to Permian, and the annularia from Devonian to Triassic. So this actually did exist during at least part of the time of the dinosaurs. Anyway, with these time ranges, what we're going to do next is to go to this part here, where it says geologic range chart. And basically what it's asking you to do is for each fossil, there are 4 of them in this section of the lab. Fossil 1, 2, 3, 4 are these 4 different fossils. 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to draw an arrow to show the range of time that they existed for. So for example, fossil number 1 lived from Silurian to Permian. So now what I'm going to do is go from the Silurian to the Permian. And I'm going to draw an arrow that looks like this. For the second one, it was during Pennsylvanian time, so my arrow is going to be very short. For the third fossil, it lived from Mississippian to Permian, so here's the start of the Mississippian going up to Permian, which would be here, and would look like that. And for fossil 4, Devonian to Triassic would be here. Now, if we look at the questions, I want to go over some of the questions because I think you'll have a difficult time with some of them. For the first question, it says, in Procedure A, what sort of sedimentary environment was necessary at the time the footprints were made? Well, in order to get good footprints, we're talking about this now, we needed a fine sediment. I'm not going to write the answers for you, that's your job, but I'll explain what the question's getting at. We need a fine sediment, and think about what you would need to have a footprint. We need fine sediment, we need it to be wet, right? So like a wet, muddy sediment, like a wet silt, a wet clay, maybe even a wet sand would make good footprints. Anything coarser than that probably wouldn't have left a good footprint. And of course, we need some water there. Dry sediment is not going to leave much of a footprint. For the second one, referring to the geologic range chart, which is this up here, in what geologic period did the rocks form? Well, if we're looking at all of these fossils, basically what the question is asking is, well, when could this rock have formed that these fossils were found in? And, again, we're looking at this rock column here. And in order for this to have formed at a certain time, well, basically, we need to look at a common time, a time when all four of these creatures lived at the same time. And the only overlap that we have is during Pennsylvanian time. And again, we'll talk about geologic time more in the future. But if we look at it, fossil 1, fossil 2, fossil 3, fossil 4, all lived together at only one time period, which was Pennsylvanian. Many of these other creatures lived at other time periods, but the only time where they all four were alive at the same time was during the Pennsylvanian, because fossil 2, the Foraminifera, was only alive during the Pennsylvanian. So for this one, the Pennsylvanian period was the only time period where all four creatures lived at the same time, which means that to have a rock sequence where all four creatures can be found, well, it had to have occurred at Pennsylvanian time. For question 3, an index fossil is something we'll talk about more in a later video, but for now I'll just give you a short explanation. I'm trying to give you just enough information to be able to successfully do the lab. An index fossil is a fossil that's a useful marker of time. An index fossil is a creature that represents a specific time period, which means that it lived for a short period of time and had a large geographic distribution. These types of fossils serve as time markers. And if we look at our fossils, well, the only fossil that has a short period of time would be fossil 2, the Foraminifera. It lived for a relatively short amount of time. So basically the idea with the index fossil is that if we found this type of Foraminifera, we know that we're dealing with the Pennsylvanian period. If you found the Annularia, for example, the plant, well, that narrows down your time frame somewhat, but you could be anywhere between Devonian and Triassic, which is millions of years. So an index fossil is one that is a creature that lived for a relatively short period of time and also had a wide geographic distribution. It was over a large part of the world. Some fossils might have only lived for a short period of time, like certain dinosaur species might have only existed for a relatively short period of time, but dinosaur fossils are rare and hard to find and don't serve as good time markers. That's what question 3 is getting at. And question 4 is basically just asking to explain why. So basically the answer to question 3 is, well, it would be the Foraminifera. And question 4 is asking you, well, why would it be the Foraminifera? For question 5, on what did you base your decision to label the layers as marine or non-marine in procedure C? I forgot to do that, so let's go back to that. If we look at these, well, marine versus non-marine, if we look at marine creatures, well, these are all shells, right? Here we have the Polychaderm. It's basically similar to a modern day clam. We have the Brachiopod, lived in water. The Foraminifera lived in water. We also have very fine sediments. This rock symbol is for shale. This is for limestone. This is very fine material. So these rock units here would be our marine units. These are rocks that formed underwater from the deposition of sediment. Then, back in time, if we go further down, well, now we have sandstones, right? These rock units here would be non-marine or land. We find the plant on land. And this tells us that the environment was changing. Generally, usually, rocks are older at the bottom and younger at top, when we're talking about sedimentary rocks anyway. So as we go from the old to the younger, we're going from land to water which basically means sea level must have been rising. We have sandstone. This is probably a sandy area, probably kind of like a beach. And then with time, we get finer and finer sediments, more fine sediments and marine creatures. So the sea level must have been rising. So here, where it's asking about marine versus non-marine, well, you're looking at the fossil types. Fossil shells indicate a marine environment. The fossil plant indicates a non-marine environment. In question 6, we just went over what change in sea level is represented by the sequence of rocks. We just talked about that. And then I think I'll let you try to figure out the conclusion for yourself. So I want to just go over the document for you. So you'll have a scanned copy of the lab that we just went over. Now, if we take a look at the lab here, vocabulary, straightforward, just look it up. Procedure A, this is where you're going to write in your short story about the footprints. Procedure B, we did together with the fossil identification. Again, you could do your drawings on a separate sheet of paper and hang on to it for when we have class again. Or you could also scan your drawings if you have a scanner, and you could just submit them with the lab. Either way would be fine. For procedure C, on the lab I drew arrows. What you could just simply do here is just put in X's like this to show the arrows. I'll just delete those. But you could do that. So you could put in the X's to show the different time periods for the 4 different fossils labeled up there. And then here are the questions that we just went over. So watch all 3 parts to the lab, all 3 videos, and then if you get stuck with any parts of the lab, you can certainly email me, but make sure that you watch all of the videos before you email me with questions. I really try to explain things thoroughly. I think that most of you would have struggled going through this by yourselves, and that's why I really went into a lot of detail to explain it so that you could just successfully complete it independently. Of course, if you have trouble, let me know. If something's not working, let me know. But hopefully you have enough information now to be able to successfully do it. So good luck, and let me know if you have any trouble.